Boker Tov. It's really a great honor to introduce Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. And an enormous zechut, a real privilege for us to have an opportunity to learn from him as part of this summer session. There's no one in the American Jewish community today whose life's work bridges the world of scholarship, education, writing, institution building, and communal leadership that Rabbi Greenberg's rich career encompasses. He provided the organized Jewish world with the theological foundations for religious pluralism. And he's transformed the way that Jews think about the religious and ethical significance of the Shoah and the State of Israel, how we understand the meaning of a return to Jewish power, and how our relationship with Christians might be understood in new ways. His creative thought, his extensive writing, and his masterful teaching is matched only by his integrity, sensitivity, and menschlichkeit. Yitz is a dear friend of Pardes and also an influential teacher of mine and so many others. I first met Yitz 34 years ago when I was a freshman in college, and later had the opportunity to be a rabbinical student intern at Klal, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, which he founded in 1974 and served as president of until 1997. Yitz and his wife Blue spend a significant part of their year here in Jerusalem. Their daughter-in-law, Abby Greenberg, is an alumna and a student in our program this summer, and a former board member. And Blue will be teaching here in 2 weeks. You'll have the opportunity to engage with her and her ideas as well. I'm so grateful that we have this opportunity to learn from Yitz, and so grateful to you, Yitz, for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. It's a privilege to be back at Pardes, which is a longtime favorite. I'm not sure who's older, me or Pardes, but it goes back a long way together. I'd like to start with a side comment, which may appear to be a side comment to my theme, but as I will try to show, I think it strengthens the theme itself. I think it's generally understood or accepted, and not just in Jewish circles, that Judaism has, thank you, that Judaism has been the most influential religion in human history, and that's because its conception of existence, it's the meaning of life, its portrait of the world, is central not just for 14 million, 15 million Jews, but has been placed at the center of Christianity, which has 1.9 billion believers or followers, and of Islam, which has 1.1 billion followers. And normally when you mention this influence, people say, oh, you're talking about monotheism, right? The idea of one God. And I don't mean to make light of that. Yes, it is, of course, a major factor in Jewish influence. Nevertheless, my thesis today is focused on a second idea, a second central teaching of Judaism that I think has influenced even more people. And that is what contemporary Jewish theology calls Tikkun Olam, and what traditional Jewish thinking generally called Mashiachiyut, Messianism. And that is the Jewish idea, the Torah's teaching, that this world, the world of flesh and blood and of the five senses, not some future world, but this world, can be, and in fact should be and will be, transformed into a paradise. And the definition of a paradise, that's why I call it Tikkun Olam, is a world in which life itself completely wins out, completely achieves the fullest dignity and its fullest value in real, actual behavioral and daily terms. I call it the religion of Tikkun Olam for that very reason, because the world as it is now is very far from that. I'll describe that in a moment. Very far from the Jewish ideal of how life should be treated or how life is precious. But the point is, Judaism says this is the calling, this is the task of humanity, that God in the Torah and through other religions also, I believe, has called humanity to join in a partnership to repair the world, to correct it from its present state and its treatment of life, particularly of human life, and to improve it and to repair it to the point where the absolute value and dignity of life wins out. So I'll start with the first point, the Torah's description of the world as it will be or should be. Of course, the Torah starts with creation. It's one of the great themes, and again, one of the great impacts of Judaism on the world. Its claim is that this world is not an accident, it's not a blind byproduct of a blind and valueless physical process. It is a creation, literally. In other words, it was shaped by a creator, that's what we call God, by a creator, a universal force that creates. And its portrait of creation, if you look at the first, it's repeated tens of times throughout the Tanakh and tradition. And it's repeated, of course, in the prayers every day. But the portrait of creation in the first chapter of Genesis, which is the classic statement of creation, is not really the portrait of the actual process of creation, of coming into being. We certainly in our time have come to see that it's a much more complicated and a much more developed scientific process or physics process than the Torah describes. What the Torah describes, I believe, therefore, is not the process of creation, but creation as it's intended to be. Creation as it will look when we complete the repair of the world, when we've achieved the messianic goal. And so what it gives us in this first chapter is kind of an ideal world. It also gives us not only a portrait of that ideal world, but it also tells us that by ideal world I mean it's a world in total harmony. It's a world that moves from chaos to order. It starts in chaos. Tohu vavohu in that language of the Tanakh. Big Bang, we would say in our language. It starts in total chaos, but it's moving toward order. And that order, those of you who are looking at the papers these days, we now have a portrait of what it looked like a mere 800 million years after the Big Bang, meaning 13 billion years ago. So it's a world that starts with total chaos but is moving toward order, toward galaxies, toward stars, toward planets, and within those planets, the beginning of life. So what the Torah suggests is the world starts in chaos and moves toward order, because that rhythm of moving toward order is what God has planted in creation. And similarly, the world starts with non-life. Our best estimates now is that the beginnings of life are 1 or 2 billion years ago compared to 13 or 14 billion of origin. So light is a very late appear in the world, as it is in creation story, where basically limited form of life appears on the third day, and the full-blown forms of life appear on the fifth and sixth day, or at the very end of the creation process. So this world, again, has a built-in rhythm, a rhythm that we as humans often miss because we have short lives. From our point of view, the world starts at life and moves toward death. But if you could see it from the divine perspective, it starts with no life, and after billions of years, one cell, and in the billion or 2 years since then, a proliferation of life. So the world is actually moving from non-life toward life. And the third dimension of this existence, according to Judaism, it's moving from lesser quality of life, lesser capacity, toward greater and more capacity of life. That movement toward life, the Torah describes as a movement toward being like God, the source, the ground of existence. Or to put it another way, the climax thus far of the development of life is human being, who is in the image of God. The image of God means, again, we're not God. A picture of me is very different than me. But the image unmistakably evokes some sense of this much greater power, this much greater force. The human capacities, whether it be in consciousness understanding, or whether it be in power, or whether it be in the capacity for love relationship, they're finite, but they're so profoundly developed that they evoke in us a sense, a vague sense, a very limited sense of what the infinite version of that is like. So why am I telling you, why does the Torah tell us these three rhythms are built into nature? From chaos to order, from non-life to life, and from less quality of life to greater? Because the Torah asks us to live in these rhythms. That is to say, our task, A, is collectively and globally to move the world toward the victory of order over chaos, toward the victory of life over non-life or death, toward the highest quality of life, which we can participate in, as we can participate the other way. We can live our lives to degrade the quality of life. We can live our lives, as unfortunately we are right now, to degrade creation and life and to destroy species rather than to enable and the growth of life and the proliferation of life. And why am I telling you all these rhythms are something we should identify with? Because this brings me to my central thesis in my talk, which is because we are asked to live our lives in accordance with these rhythms and help in this partnership with God to assure that the fullness of the image of God will be developed in every human being, and the fullness of life and its dignity all around us will also be realized in this repaired world. So if you followed me so far, let me stop and ask the first and central question of my talk, which is, what does it mean, the dignity or the value or the significance of being an image of God? That is what the Torah says is so far the crown of creation. I keep saying so far because if one can project ahead another billion years, maybe we'll have a superior being that's evolved beyond our capacity. But for the moment, this is the best we can do, so we start with this one. So the answer to the question of what does it mean to be an image of God, and not only in terms of capacity, but in terms of value and dignity, to this we have a very serious source and answer in the tradition. If you look at the sources that have been distributed, it's a classic case. It's a case of capital punishment. It's a Mishnah in Sanhedrin. It's a Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Daf 37a, page 37a. The Mishnah tells us of the ceremony. When you have a capital punishment case, what's at stake is that the defendant, if convicted, could be put to death. So the rabbis felt that the witnesses who come to testify should not be allowed to testify, or let's put it another way, they can't simply take an oath to tell the truth. You know why? But first you have to know what's at stake in your conversation, in your witness, in your testimony. If you don't understand this full significance of an image of God, you will not be capable of giving an accurate or precise or restrained testimony. You know what it's like? I'm testifying in a case, somebody's suing for $1,000, $10,000. Again, I'll tell the truth, I'll do my best because I'm a witness. But if this is a suit for $1 billion, and I realize that every word of mine could be tens of millions of dollars, I'm going to be very careful, very precise, try to be as accurate and as particular as I can. In a sense, so Chazal felt before you can testify in a capital punishment case, first you have to understand what's at stake in the image of God of the one who was killed or of the person who is now on trial for murder. And here's what the Mishnah says. I'll skip down. It goes through a whole series of warnings to the witnesses. You shouldn't go by hearsay, you shouldn't go by estimate, you should only speak accurately and so on. But this is the second half of the Mishnah now. And why does the Torah tell us this story about Adam, the creation of Adam, the creation of Tzom Elokim? Lefichach, it's about halfway down. Lefichach nivra Adam Yechidi. That's why the Torah tells us this whole story about the human being being created as a single individual. That's not what happened. But it's a narrative, and the purpose of this narrative is to teach you. L'lamdach, to teach you, everybody who reads this passage, shekol ha'ma'abed nefesh achas b'nei adam. If you wipe out one life, marle olav ha'kasev ki'ilu ibed olam, it's as if you wiped out a whole world. V'chol ha'mekayem nefesh achas b'nei adam, someone who saves or upholds one life of a human being, as if he upheld or saved a whole world. Now, I want to stop and take a look and ask the question, what does it mean if I save one life as I saved the whole world? Why? One life. Right now there are 8.7 billion, actually there are a few more since I started to speak, okay, but 8.7 billion in this world, right? So why should one life be equal to 8.7 billion? And in fact, in a very real sense, it's not literally so, because when you make certain decisions, in fact, you will sometimes sacrifice life for the sake of the Lord. But why? What is the Mishnah trying to say about a dignity of an image of God? That one human, saving one human, is the equivalent of saving literally a whole world of 8 billion people. Can you help me out here? Have any thought what that might imply? Please.
Potential for the future.
So one, of course, very good answer. And of course, Rashi, others say that because this one life, you're not just testifying with this one life. This life has the potential to have children and grandchildren, and the truth is the whole world started with, so to speak, there was one human being, or there were young human pair, and from that came billions. So what's at stake is that there's many more involved, much more larger numbers than just the individual. That's one possible answer. Now we'll try one more, please.
What about that everybody is unique? First of all, that each person is different, so when you kill one, there's no other one like that one.
We'll come back to
And
unique in a
also
moment.
From their own perspective.
You're absolutely right. The only reason I don't think it's this passage is because we'll come to that passage in about 2 minutes. It is in the Mishnah, but it's an excellent observation. Please.
A person can affect everyone.
So one person can affect the whole world. Okay, good. Any other suggestion?
If each person's the image of God, then each person's like a microcosm of God, and God started the whole world, so each person is almost like a whole
It's a
world.
microcosm of the whole world. These are all wonderful answers. Let me try to, nevertheless, throw out another possibility. There is one mathematical term in which one equals every other term in the whole thing. What is that mathematical term? Sorry? And thank you, infinity, right? In other words, one infinity includes or is equivalent to unlimited infinity. Or look another way. I think what the Mishnah is trying to say is that every human being has infinite value. Images of man have limited value. For example, a so-called Leonardo da Vinci Salvador Mundi sold for $450 million. About 5 years ago. It's now in question, but okay, $450 million. But an image of God is infinitely valuable. And if you save one infinity, it is the equivalent of saving 1 billion infinities or 8 billion infinities. So I think what the Mishnah is trying to tell us is that every human being should be seen as and treated as a being of infinite value. Now again, I'll take 1 minute more to figure out if you have infinite value, what that implies. I can think of a number of implications. I'll draw one right now. No amount of money is too much to spend to save your life because you're infinitely valuable. In a perfect world, I'd spend millions just to save one person's life. In a perfect world, no one would lack for medical insurance so that they would have to wait or sometimes risk death or sickness because they don't have enough money to treat the particular disease that has afflicting them. Infinite value. Now let me take the second element in the Mishnah. The second dignity has a great implication for equality, for the peace and harmony among people, namely, Shelo Yomar Adam La'achavero Abba Gadol Me'ovicha. No human being who is an image of God can say to someone else, I have a superior ancestry to you. my father, I'm a son of a king or of a noble aristocracy, you are just a plebeian. Why can't they say that, since we're all one parent and we're all images of God? In effect, every human being is equal to every other. Let me sharpen that. It's another way of saying that there is no preferred image of God. In fact, in general Jewish law, what is a preferred image of God treated by in Jewish law? It's idolatry. When I take a picture of Zeus or of Astarte or of Venus and say, this is God, this is what God looks like, that's idolatry. Every human being, in all their variety, including men, women, trans, whatever you name it, they all resemble image of God. But the claim that one is preferred, one is superior, is a form of idolatry. Because every image, in other words, the truth is that a Leonardo da Vinci or a Van Gogh is a better product or is worth a lot more than a Yitz Greenberg drawing. But that doesn't matter, because the substantive point is, when it comes to the image of God, they are all equal. How can you be worth more than me if I'm infinitely valuable? You can't be anything more than that. Which brings me to the third dignity of an image of God. We'll skip the next line or two, because that's about theological. Ulahagid gedulato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This teaches you a third dignity, shows you the greatness of God. Why? Adam tovea kama matbeos b'chotem echad. A person can create many, substantively can create many images, many stamps, many coins from one mold. V'kulan domen zelazeh. Every stamp comes out the same way. If you happen to have an upside down flying Jenny in your stamp, it's worth several $1 million because it's very rare. In general, you can depend on every stamp, every dollar bill, every $20 Andrew Jackson bill, they're all alike. When you've seen one, you've seen them all. But that's human creations. The image of God, Melech Malchei Amlochem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Tova Kol Adam B'chos Samo Shel Rabbi. We are all descended from one couple, and yet, Ein Echad Me'en Doma Lechaveiro. So the third dignity of an image of God is that, unlike an image of man, if you've seen one, you haven't seen them all. Each one is unique, irreplaceable. There never will be, there never has been anybody just like you, or me, or anybody. Even identical twins are not identical. So if you look carefully, if you encounter a human being, and this is the main punchline I want to leave you with, to be a human being in the image of God is to recognize your infinite value, to recognize your uniqueness, to recognize your equality. What's a stereotype? What's a stereotype? What's an attempt to say that whites are privileged, or that, for that matter, colored people are less? What is that an attempt to do? It's a denial of the uniqueness. And sometimes the denial can pose as even a positive one. All Jews are smart, or all African Americans are basketball, have rhythm, whatever. Those are supposedly positive stereotypes, but in the end they're a denial. They're a denial of the dignity of the image of God, of each individual. So if you look at the person next to you, if you look at the person that you meet every day, if you really get to know them, that's what you will discover the truth. When you really get to know them, not just an intellectual or a casual encounter, but if you profoundly encounter them, and you will realize the infinite value, the inequality and the uniqueness of this person. So the put down, the knock, all these things are attempts, are either denial or failure to make that connection. Now I want to leave one more important point here that completes this Mishnah and its implications for us as human beings, religious people. In the Darim, the Talmud asked the question, in the Yerushalmi, asked the question, is there some fundamental principle of the Torah? Is there some basic klal gadol, some great principle from which you can derive the whole Torah? It's like Einstein's great dream. He wanted to find one equation that from which you could derive all of reality and all of physics. Well, this is the same question the Gemara is asking. Is there some klal gadol from which you can derive the whole Torah? And here's what it says. This is in Yerushalmi. This is the bottom of the page. V'ahavta re'echa kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Rabbi Akiva Omer zeh klal gadol. Right. This is the great principle of the Torah. If you understand the implications of Ahavta, if you live up to it, it will account for all the mitzvos of the Torah. Ben Azai Omer, no, there's an even greater principle. Zeh Sefer Toldos Adam, B'dmut Elokim and Tzelem Elokim Baraoto. That's from Genesis 5:1. Zeh Klal Gadol Mizeh. Ben Azai says there's an even more fundamental principle. And the fundamental principle is the human being is in the image of God. Now let me take an extra minute to understand again what we mean by a fundamental principle. Look at the Pnei Moshe, that's the commentary on the right side of the text. The Pnei Moshe says, Mikra shel havta kamocha, that's according to Rabbi Akiva, or Tzelem Elokim according to Rabbi Azai and us. Ikar gadol hu l'kayem. This is a fundamental principle to help you observe or live up to the Torah, l'kiyam haTorah. Shemitoch klal, mitoch kach. If you would understand, if you would internalize the image of God or the love your neighbor as yourself, then you will be careful in how you treat people, interact with them, how you do business with them, right? You would also not be jealous. You would show the possible respect. If you would live up to this principle, I should put on my glasses here, right? Yizahir meharbe averos v'yikayim rov hamitzvos. The point of the Klal Gadol is if you live by this, then you will automatically not do the sins the Torah describes, or as it were, you will naturally and automatically do all the mitzvah. So only modification I want to make for that is, of course, I say not most, but all. I would argue what the fundamental principle means, that you should not look at the Torah as a set of laws, a set of commandments. You say, well, God tells me what to do. That's not really what's going on. It's not that God tells me arbitrarily, be kind, or don't hurt, or don't steal, or don't kill. If you understand this human being that you're encountered with as an image of God, you will automatically, emotionally live up to this. And I'll turn now, if I can, to page 2 of your sources to exactly explore that with you. You hear what I'm saying? It's not a set of laws. It's a set of responses which are emotionally and natural, proper, if you encounter this person next to you or the person you're interacting with as an image of God. I'll take a moment before we go into I want to explore a few mitzvahs as an example. You'll help me show how that each commandment is rooted in the dignities of an image of God, which are infinite value, equality, uniqueness. But before we go through that top page, take a quick look to Rabbi Soloveitchik's quote, which I think helps articulate what I'm trying to say. The value of kavod habriot, honoring people, is the ideological hinge foundation of many halachot, many laws of the Torah. Burial, why do you have to bury the body? Honoring the dead. Priestly impurity, a priest is allowed to make himself impure only for the sake of honoring immediate relatives who have died. The mitzvah of burying an abandoned body. The state of mourning before burial. All these expressions that an elder is excused from duties which may be beneath him. Shaming one's companion publicly. These are all sins. It's possible because they grow out of the idea of respect for a fellow human being. In fact, this is Soloveitchik's main point. It is possible that all the commandments between one person and another, ben adam lechavero as they're called in Hebrew, are based on the value of honoring human beings. And his last line, in Psalms 8:8, the concept of image of God is translated into you treated him, human beings should be treated with honor and respect. The concept of image of God is exchanged in rabbinic language into kavod habriot, showing respect for your fellow human beings. Now let's apply that to actual laws. I took, somewhat arbitrarily, a set of laws from Kedoshim, the famous Holiness Code in Vayikra. Vayikra 19:13. Lo tashok et reacha, do not exploit your fellow human being or kinsman. V'lo tigzol, do not steal. So is this simply a commandment, or, help me, what is it? Not the commitment not to steal is a way of honoring what about you? About this other person?
That they are Tzelem Elohim,
Exactly, and therefore it's instead Tzelem Elokim.
infinitely valuable.
So if you're infinitely valuable, I don't want to reduce your value by taking something from you unfairly and giving you nothing in return. I'm literally impoverishing you. Excuse me. If you're equal to me, then if I take something from you, I owe it back in return to give you something of equal value. That's why I pay for it. If I steal it, if I swindle it, if I take it by force, I'm violating your equality and your dignity. So stealing, or how about take the commandment which I didn't list here, how about thou shalt not murder? What's that about? Why is thou shalt not murder one of the three primary laws in the Torah that you overrule every other law to save a life, but not this one? Why is murder such a high level law? Why? Because
Destroy a whole universe.
you're throwing a whole universe, because you are taking a creature of infinite value and wiping it out. You're taking a creature that is unique that no one can replace and wiping it out. So that's the ultimate violation. Murder. It's one of three ultimate violations in the rabbinic tradition. Okay, of course the flip side of that is, in every other mitzvah, it's a mitzvah to override them to save a life. Why? Because you're saving infinite value. Because you're saving a unique thing that no one else can replace. And therefore it's a mitzvah, and all the commandments should be seen as enabling, not as overriding this obligation. Let's continue. Lo t'kalel cheresh, do not curse a deaf person. V'lifnei ivil lo titen michshol, you should not take advantage of or harm a handicapped person. What's the basis of this law? It's not just the law. What's the basis of such a feeling?
Everyone has infinite value.
Because a disabled person is no less infinitely valuable than a person who is completely healthy. So to take advantage and turn that disability into a handicap, into a degradation, into a weakness that I can abuse, that's a violation of Tzelem Elokim. Continuing, we're talking about a court case, a judge ruling, or in any case between people that I myself, as a teacher or as a parent or whatever, have to rule on. B'tzedek tishpot amitecha, you have to. Lo tisal pnei dal, when you give justice, it must be done righteously, equally, neutrally. Lo tisal pnei dal, you should not give extra weight to a poor person. V'lo tedar pnei ashir, you should not, pnei gadol, nor should you give extra honor or weight to a rich person. Judge your neighbor in righteousness. What's the issue involved again?
Equality.
Exactly. In other words, now by the way, we are supposed to give special help to the poor. There are many laws that cover that. But that's because of their need. But if it comes to a justice issue, to an issue of judgment and justice, there to say because you're poor, you can get away with it, or I'll let you take advantage, or a criminal. I mean, this is a major issue in our lifetime with the whole issue of the woke culture. Again, you're saying that a victim can do no wrong. It's not true. It's a violation of the dignity of the other side. So that's one of the great tensions here. But you have to learn, when it comes to a judgment, there is room for special help. There's room for recognition of people have extra needs. But when it comes to making a judgment, is it right or wrong, or is it judgment between people sometimes? The answer is favoritism is a violation of the dignity, whether it be favoritism for the rich or the poor, which is more typical, or favoritism for the poor, which is less typical but is present in certain ethical codes. You wanted to say something, Sam?
Yes, I just didn't hear. You said it's topical with which issue?
No, it's topical in our lifetime because it's a whole major issue right now. There's a serious, I guess it's intersectionality. There are various versions of this, which are basically saying that if you are a victim or if you are in a deprived class, that your behavior is automatically right, or automatically justified, or automatically not to be condemned because you are the victim and therefore you are not to be judged for this. And sometimes it takes the form of the other side. If you're privileged, then automatically you're wrong. It doesn't matter whether in fact the actual behavior is just or correct. So I'm saying this is not just a theoretical issue, this is a contemporary, very serious issue. Again, as I say, it's a juggling act which has been simplified into a wrong violation of Tzelem Elokim. The juggling act is how do you balance the special need, special help, special suffering of these people, which deserves extra attention, as against the objective and reality that in this particular case, the other side may be doing the right thing, or they're being unfair or unjust to other people's treatment. And so how do you justify or how do you judge that? And the answer here is in the end, you don't suspend that because it's a Tzelem Elokim on both sides. I'll give one more example and I won't, Lo telech rachil b'amecha. This is, of course, the Torah's way, the Rabbi's understanding is this is Lashon Hara. Now, what's true about Lashon Hara as compared to gossip? What's true about Lashon Hara? It is a truth. I'm telling you something evil or wrong about you. It's a truth. Nevertheless, it's a sin. Why is it a sin? It's the truth. So what's the answer? The answer is, yes, there are circumstances in which I have to tell the truth, and if it's a bad truth, I must tell it. For example, I'm about to go into a business deal with this person, and you know this is a swindler. There's done it many times. Then you owe it to me to tell me this. Or he's about to marry her, and you know that he's a cad or he's violent or whatever. It's a mitzvah to tell this person. It's a need to know. But if I don't need to know, I'm a total stranger to this person. Why are you coming and telling me about this person that they're bad or this? The answer is because you're degrading. That's what it's really all about. I have no need to know, but you're telling me to drag them down, to say they're not really equal value, they're a cad, they're nothing. So the violation of Lashon Hara is that it may be telling the truth, but it's a violation of the image of God of the other person. Please.
My question is, this concept works very well with mitzvot by Adam and Chavayro. How would you apply it to something like tefillin?
I thank you for asking that. The answer is I made a personal judgment. Now we're going to have time to do justice to Ben Adam Mamokom, but I'll say it in 1 minute. I would argue, I'm speaking myself, Rabbi Salvation, I pushed him to, he says Ben Adam Chavayro, he didn't say L'Molam Mamokom. I would say L'Molam Mamokom, meaning what? That every mitzvah, I would argue, is an attempt, even between us and God, is an attempt, or brings with it the awareness of the value of Tzelem Elokim. For example, I'll take the easy one first. Pesach, Matzah, Seder, what's it all about? It's about the freeing of the slaves. Or another way of saying that Ben Adam Mamokom, in this case, a commandment toward God, is actually a way of reminding me that every human being is free and meant to be free, and slavery is a violation of the dignity of Tzelem Elokim. Now, tefillin, I would argue in the same way. What it depends what he's saying. What is tefillin about? Well, tefillin is partly about to remind me that there is a God, and therefore there is a God of which my fellow human beings are images of God. First of all, tefillin includes in there reminders of Yitziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus. So if we had time, I'd be glad to explore that with you. Shabbat, I would argue all these in the long run also come back to the teaching. And the point behind all of this is my general argument, that the halakha, Jewish observance, is not a matter of series of laws and precedents. It's a series of implications, emotional responses, relationship, feelings about fellow human beings when they recognize their image of God. Now, what's the consequence of that? Partly my answer again is living in our time where we're reconsidering certain laws precisely for that reason. Certain traditional laws that do not do justice, for example, excuse me, for the full value of women or the full equality of women. My argument is this is not a violation or a change. It's a fulfillment of the idea that we recognize Zachar u'Nekeva Abraham, that men and women were both in the image of God. And therefore, in our time, we see much more clearly that this limitation or exclusion of women is a denial. At that time, it wasn't recognized, but I recognize it now as a denial of women's equality and dignity, and therefore I'm fulfilling rather than rejecting the law and making the next step. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, my question was about this idea of Lashon Hara, and I was wondering how, like, a profession like journalism fits into that framework of like, what becomes a public good, when does knowledge become a public good, and how to consider that in terms of degrading a person.
I love that. So you'll invite me back, we'll spend the whole session together, and you'll help me spell it out. You're right, because this implied in this is ethics of journalism, and there should be limits on journalism, and one of the problems, on the one hand, journalism and the media in general, I think are the key to preserving the integrity and the freedom and the dignity, and on the other hand, they, so as we see now, particularly in social media, they can be a force for degradation and denial and running down and hatred, and so, yeah, it's a full-time job to just develop an ethic based on this, but I think you're on the right track to raise the issue. Okay, now let me take one other final point and then throw it open to your response and questions. And that is the question of, just as I've tried to argue that each commandment of the Torah is defined in the end as a way of upholding the dignity of the image of God. And the great challenge of religious life is to educate ourselves, to encounter people genuinely. There is not to be put off by stereotype, by historic categories, by separation, by ghettoization, by lack of familiarity, to encounter them in all their uniqueness, in all their value. And that will lead us to an ethic of responsibility and mutual dignity and so on. That's a major challenge right there. Having said that, what I want to conclude is the other version. What Judaism tries to do, as I say, it gives us a picture of this future perfection and says we should live in the meantime toward it. So how do you live in the meantime toward it, as I've tried to show with these examples here? And for example, right now, we don't have full equality, we haven't had historically, full equality for women, or full dignity for gay, or one could go through a whole long list of where there are serious handicaps in this dignity, and this is our challenge of our time, or our opportunity to move it forward. The other thing I want to get, and this I want to finish with this, is the messianic aspect. Judaism says our dream is to perfect the world. Well, what's the perfection of the world? So my answer is, the perfection is to so upgrade the world, this world, that the dignities of infinite value, equality and uniqueness, will be honored on a daily basis and taken for granted. So if you turn with me to the next set of pages of your text, if you take a look at the prophetic vision of the future world that we're trying to get to. So if you look carefully, I'll just run through it, I don't have time to read all the verses. According to Isaiah, we will overcome poverty and hunger. Ezekiel will overcome poverty and hunger. Now what's overcoming poverty and hunger got to do with the image of God?
Everybody's the same.
I'm sorry?
Everybody's the same.
Well, everybody is the same or equal, and what happens in poverty? What happens in poverty? Well, for example, in poverty, people can't afford education, so they don't send their children to school. Or they can't afford it and they'll send the boys and not the girls. So what happens? So the development of this person, their capacity to earn, their capacity to appreciate life, to understand life, is seriously handicapped. So poverty is not just a lack of money, and it is. It leads to lack of food, it leads to lack of medicine, it leads to serious drawbacks, but no less it leads to a cramping or a choking off of the potential of growing into a full person, into a full Tzalma Elokim. So the truth is, if you want to bring the Messiah, it's not just a question of social justice, but overcoming poverty is a major contribution. Now, why do I mention this? Because you may not be planning to go into social work or into law, but you're thinking of going to business. So my answer is that can be a major way of bringing the Messiah. Namely what? Create economic, commercial development which raises the standard of living and the standard of dignity. It's one of the amazing accomplishments of the last century. And what is that? In the last century, almost 1 billion people have been taken out of poverty. And again, poverty expressed itself in 1,000 ways, in sickness, in lack of development, in lack of clean water, and in 100 different ways. So raising the level of income, of value, of money, of people, could be a major way. What's the catch? Not the catch, or what's the covenantal limit about that? You want to make sure that in developing economic and raising standards, what do you have to be aware of? Well, how about polluting the earth so that you've raised the standard of living, but you're now causing such carbon? Everybody can afford a car now, everybody can afford meat now, which they couldn't before, and the cows, feeding the cows, it deals a lot of methane. In other words, the challenge is to create a better world that has so much money. Again, a concrete example. In the 1970s, there was this great and wonderful idea. People brought testimony to Congress that every year several thousand people died, 5,000 to 10,000 died, who needed kidney dialysis. Their kidneys were failing, and the technology existed, but they couldn't afford it. So the United States government, in good intentions, passed a law that everybody who needs dialysis is paid for by the government Medicare. What happened next? Well, you can guess. There was an explosion of dialysis and treatment, which was great. It grew so expensive and so great that it was eating up the rest of Medicare, and it became obvious at some point that people with cancer or heart trouble were not getting proper treatment because they couldn't afford it. So in other words, again, the trick is, in order to really have the level of medicine that everybody gets, whatever they need, you have to be a much wealthier country. It is not meant to exempt the United States, which, for example, doesn't do half as good a job as Israel on setting a basket of medical coverage for everybody in the country. Nevertheless, my point is increasing wealth or increasing agricultural productivity so that there's no hunger. That's one of the great accomplishments of the past century. There's now enough food produced to feed everybody in the world. What's the problem? Why is there still famine? It's distribution. It's the failure to distribute, and that's a major challenge ahead of us too. So according to the prophets, you can bring the Messiah not just by justice, but by improving the economy and improving the level of the standard of living. Continuing, we overcome oppression. That's the next page. When the Messiah comes in the Messianic age, we'll judge the poor with equity, decide with justice for the lonely. And right now, even in democracy, rich people get better or more justice than poor people because they don't have as good they have a better lawyer, they have better connection. In the Messianic age, we're going to develop equality before the law in every fully sense of the word. Okay, I wouldn't go on. We overcome war. Famous line, right? They'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into rooks. Why do we have to overcome war?
It takes away from life.
It wipes out infinitely valuable, equally people. That's how you win a war. Why do we have war now? Why is it a mitzvah to have a war of self-defense? Why is it a mitzvah? Because we're protecting life and the dignity of life. That's in an imperfect world. But if we could improve the world to the point where there's no need to resort to war, or there's a balance of power which is honored by everybody and no one goes to war, that is one of our goals. And that's one of the ways you work to make a better world. And one could go on and on. We overcome sickness and death. According to Isaiah, in the Messianic age, we'll cure blindness, the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the lame will dance. What's he talking about? Why is it important to overcome Why is it important to overcome illness? To bring the Messianic age?
Equality.
It's equality, it's value. How about uniqueness? How about Alzheimer's? What does Alzheimer's do to a person? They lose their memory. What does that mean? It means they lose their uniqueness. They lose their memory. They lose their personal experience. They lose their recognition. This is my child. This is my parent. This is my friend. So the truth is, if we want to perfect the world, we have as a major goal to work on curing all these diseases which handicap, hurt, or degrade the quality of life of people. So what's my final point from all this? Just as Judaism says, live every day to the maximum possible to honor these dignities, so it says, as a society, as a culture, as an economy, as a polity, that should be our other goal, to try to create circumstances which raise people out of poverty, out of hunger, out of war, out of sickness. And that is also as much a part of Tikkun Olam as is to give, yes, legal equity before the law to the poor, as it is to give equal justice to everybody, whatever skin color or whatever social background they may come from. In short, I offer you Tzelem Elokim as the fundamental principle of Judaism, which not only guides all of the observances and all of the visions and dreams that we seek, but also can guide us in how we move through the stages of getting closer and closer to that ideal. How do we get closer to full equality for everybody? How do we get closer to full recognition of the uniqueness of individuals and their, be it in gender, be it in personality, be it in understanding. In short, my argument is that part of religious development is to develop our own capacity, our own emotional capacity, to be like God, image of God, meaning to have the consciousness that tries to understand the world, and yes, understand the world to the point where I can cure diseases as part of becoming an image of God, to develop my understanding and capacity of love, right? Tov Hashem la'kol v'rachmav al kol ma'asav. We say in the Ashrei 3 times a day, God is good to everyone because God's mercy, God's mother love, is for all God's creatures. How do we develop in ourselves and in our children and our friends the capacity to love every creature, to feel mother love for the person next to me, for the stranger, as well as for myself? This is, in a sense, the unfinished agenda, or I would say, the overriding goal of the religious life and of the approach to life as a religious life.